Anna, we put out a question to our audience last week about how they view their role as an English language educator, given English's dominance as a language of power.
And we got no responses.
No responses. Nope. Perhaps it was too big a question.
Oh, yes. Today we're tackling a behemoth of a topic.
And that doesn't mean that we don't want to hear from our listeners.
No, of course not. Don't be scared.
Don't be scared.
But today we're going to unpack a bit of English as a lingua franca and how its position of power on a global scale is reflected in the English language classroom.
Of course, the role that the English language has played in bringing together people from different linguistic backgrounds is immense. But we can't just look at its emergence through rose-colored glasses.
Nope.
If we look back at the history of English, it's impossible to deny its role in colonization, right? The imposition of English had led to the erasure of other languages, cultures, and identities.
Yes, erasure abroad, but also in the United States, cultures that were suppressed by English-speaking invaders, but also the way English is imposed as the golden standard in today's world, erasing cultures within English-speaking countries and taking over the cultures of others with the exportation of English as lingua franca.
Yeah. From very early on, language was weaponized and ultimately made to be a tool that defined who belonged and who didn't. And that's still the case. We've seen an uptick in recent years of instances of microaggressions related to language use, more specifically, use of any language other than English in a country where English is expected to be spoken. So there is this history across the globe of othering based on language use.
Exactly. And so the teaching of English feels problematic because it's the language of power, and there's a lot of erasure and othering that occurs because of its geopolitical prominence, even within the microcosm that is the classroom. But I think that this is something that can be mitigated a bit with some reflection.
Right. So as English language educators, we recognize the reality that there is a clear advantage to learning English. But I think what's important is how we're framing the learning of English. Are we framing it as the only path to success? Are we asking students to place more value on learning English than on maintaining their home language identity? Are we asking students to conform to rigid expectations regarding grammatical structure and working towards neutralizing their accents? And have we paused to think about how those myopic approaches are not only limiting, but affecting a learner's sense of self and value?
Hello, and welcome to the Teacher Think-Aloud podcast, a podcast for reflective practice for teachers of English around the world. I'm your co-host, Anna.
And I'm Shay. I want to start us off with a quote from Roosevelt's 1919 letter to the American Defense Society, a quote that really gets us to understand the power of English as a system of oppression. He says, quote, "We have room but for one language here, and that is the English language. For we intend to see that the crucible turns our people out as Americans, of American nationality, and not as dwellers in a polyglot boarding house. And we have room for but one sole loyalty, and that is loyalty to the American people."
Whoa, those are some pretty powerful and hurtful words.
Seriously, this focus on supreme English monolingualism is just
Racist?
Yeah, a system of oppression built into the very fabric of our nation.
Now, this is not to say that English is all about oppression. People around the world learn English because it can empower them in the globalized world. A former student of mine a few years ago shared her goals related to English learning and said, quote, "English is like a bridge that connects different parts of the world, creating a big family. And I want my country to become a worthy member of that family."
I love that. It really highlights just how much power language can have in uniting people of different cultural and linguistic backgrounds. But we do need to recognize how English has been used and how it helps to impose a power dynamic worldwide. English really lies on this spectrum of giving and taking away power. And I think recognizing this as English language educators gives us the opportunity to frame it as such in our practice.
Yeah, that's it. There's a need to bring to the surface the beauty that emerges from a shared language, but also the damage that it has done and continues to do. The way we frame how we're teaching English in the classroom is really important because with what we're teaching, we're also imposing some kind of cultural norm as native speakers of English.
Yes.
There's a need for hedging and softening to account for differences and account for the fact that our culture is not the only way of doing things, right?
Yes. And because we live and teach in the US, this idea of assimilation into the target language and culture is especially prominent. It's something that's deeply embedded in our society. So, how can we move away from ethnocentrism in our practice? How do we teach the English language in a way that's not purely Anglo-centric when learning the language is the goal?
I think we can tackle that by explicitly discussing the different cultural lenses we can see the world from. So I think I've mentioned this before, right? Not teaching the essay as like, this is the way you write an essay, but teaching the essay as, this is the way that this audience within this context will perceive this essay.
Right. So, in that, I can't help but think about Kaplan's cross-cultural writing images. When you're presenting essay writing to students, you're not saying things like, okay, well, here's our direct linear essay structure in English, and this is what you should be aspiring to. Instead, you're asking them to consider the context and how parties within the context will receive information that they're relaying. So you might emphasize the fact that in North American academic culture, people are used to a very linear style of writing. And if something isn't stated explicitly, it remains unclear for readers.
I think bringing these different norms to their attention can be helpful, highlighting the connections between the language and culture of the student body and saying things like, this is what you do and here's why, and this is why it's valid.
So yeah, basically making it known that everyone's perspective is valid, everyone's language is valid. The way we treat our students' native cultures is also really important to consider. We're used to this norm of English only in the language classroom. And while there is some value because they're there to learn English, it's like a really delicate dance. Because when you're requiring that your students only use English, you're invalidating someone else's language in a sense for that period of time.
We're walking a really fine line because we know that, immersing yourself in the target language is by far one of the most effective strategies to actually acquire that language. But as language and especially English educators, we still have to ask ourselves how we are also placing value and merit on the students' linguistic and cultural identities.
So it is all about framing, right? Like understanding the lens from which you're leading your class. I guess like just being aware of that and your tendencies to maybe impose language norms or cultural norms. And I think shifting into that mindset of listening, the way that you frame things is one thing. And then I think that it connects to how you're listening. So instead of making statements, are you asking questions? Then are you hearing? Are you allowing students space to bring their languages and their cultural, their sociolinguistic identities? Are you giving them the space for that? And are you actually listening to what they're saying?
There's a lot of stuff I'm sure that you and I and many other teachers do that is very subliminal. And I think that that's where most of the impact is drawn from. What are the little messages that we give to students just in the way that we're communicating with them?
And I think the whole point here is just while we're teaching English, let's not frame English as like the golden child. Let's give space for them to want to be proud of their own languages and their own cultures,
I think this idea of cultural pride speaks to the phenomenon of students creating their own English names. You and I have worked a lot with students of different cultural and linguistic backgrounds within China, and different Chinese languages and dialects have sounds that are really challenging for native English speakers to pronounce. So a lot of times students will give themselves an English name or names that they feel will be easier for native speakers to pronounce rather than the names they were given.
Ah, yes. All the Bobs and Lindas I've had over the years.
Right. But also the super creative Sunnies and Cloris. I just love to see how they embody their names. But I get it. There are reasons that in that culture, they've kind of developed this idea of choosing an English name. And I think a lot of people in the US are relieved about that.
Sure. I think accommodating interlocutors is the primary goal for most. But I also imagine that it's pretty frustrating when people can't even be bothered to try to learn to say their birth names or they give it a half-hearted attempt. It pains me that so many of our students come to this understanding that their name is just too much of a hindrance, that we could possibly spend, I don't know, 10 minutes trying to get the pronunciation. I mean, I get really excited when I have that one student who keeps their birth name. They enter this new culture and they maintain a piece of their home identity.
Yeah. And so I always try as best I can to make them feel like it's not an encumbrance for me to say it. Making sure that you have someone's name right is the easiest way, I think, to show that you care about that person.
Mhm. And I think asking someone what they prefer to be called is key too. Like your accurate pronunciation of their birth name is not just about how impressive you are for learning it, it's
Mm-mm.
about calling an individual what they want to be called. Someone may not want to be called by their birth name, and it has nothing to do with your pronunciation. What would you like to be called?
Please call me Anna, not Anna.
Mm.
I like that you emphasize that their answer might not be what you expect. It might go beyond, it's easier for Westerners to pronounce, right?
Mhm.
I remember this guy, Leo Schmidt. He worked at various institutions in New York City. And I remember hearing him talk about, I think it was his PhD research
Mm.
on Chinese students' choice of English names. For a lot of those students, they actually love their English names. It isn't always just to assimilate.
Mm.
Like, I'm a huge Friends fan, so my name is Phoebe, right? That's a really basic example, but for some of them, it might have significance. So I think the way that you approach it is asking, what do you like about the name? Not the assumption that they're just taking on a name that's easier for you and everyone else.
Exactly. This idea makes me think of how self-naming can tell us so much about our students, from interest to multiplicitous identity. I think it's worth noting that within our ESOL context, we work with students who might be first generation immigrants, second generation, 1.5ers.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's so many different ways that students show up in our class. I noticed that this concept of identity is problematic in that we just tend to make assumptions about people's identities because of their names or because of where they were born. But identity is something so personal.
It's true.
Like, I had a student a few semesters back who was born in India and moved to the US when he was 2 years old. He doesn't speak his parents' language. They hardly speak their native languages at home because they're so westernized. And he really takes pride in his Western identity. He doesn't use his birth name. He goes by a really simplified version because that's his way of coming into his own. This new identity, like his adopted country identity that he values and resonates with. It resonates with him so much more than his home country and culture.
And I think we also have to be careful not to assume anything about the culture our students are bringing to the classroom.
Mm.
I think that making assumptions about a person, how they identify culturally, is just another way that we continue to stand in our limited perspectives instead of welcoming different realities and ways of existing.
Right. So, for example, assuming that someone is an English language learner just based on their name or their appearance, it's kind of messed up.
Yeah, not everyone with a non anglicized name is an English language learner. English, like in the case of your student, is their native language, really.
And also, this bugs me a lot. Students who are born in English speaking countries, but not the traditional USA, UK, Australia, New Zealand, etc., where the white people are, right? What about people who were born in Nigeria or India, where English is a national language?
It upsets me so much when I see Indian students who simply speak a different variety of English sitting in my class to make their English conform to some kind of unicorn standard English.
Ugh, I know. And this doesn't happen only in the US, but also in an EFL context. As you and I have discussed before, many teachers we've worked with abroad report feeling pressure to conform to the expectation of doing things the way things are done in the US or in another English speaking country, the white countries.
Yes, there is so much emphasis placed on learning American English or British English.
Mhm.
This highlights this mindset that any English that doesn't come from the mouths of the colonizers isn't valid. It's not English.
Mm.
And not only is this racist, but it ignores the reality that English is considered an official language in so many countries outside of the West.
Yes.
And their English shouldn't be called non-standard because there's nothing non-standard about it.
Mhm. And so often this shows up in the classroom when students who actually do speak English, it just doesn't sound like American or British English. but it's indisputably English, they're told that they need to work on their English.
Ah,
I know we're getting mad here.
yeah. And commonly individuals accept that as their truth. And they'll say things like, I learned English and have been learning English from a very young age, but like my pronunciation isn't good, or my pronunciation isn't standard. It's not American or British.
And I've heard, I want to work on my pronunciation so it sounds better, more like yours.
Yuck.
Uh-huh.
Who decided what English is better? Why is there a hierarchy anyway?
Yeah, so much yuck, right? And in these moments, I encourage individuals to embrace the fact that, all of the languages that you speak are finding little ways to embellish your English, making it more complex and uniquely you. And that's something that we as educators need to celebrate.
So I'm guessing, Shay, you're not a fan of accent reduction.
Oh my gosh. I have had exactly one experience trying to do my version of accent reduction. I had a student from Bangladesh, and he worked in the US, he lived in New York, and he had some sort of corporate position. And his company was actually paying for him to receive lessons in accent reduction. And from the very first time I sat down with him, I was like, I don't know that I'm the right person to be sitting with you, because I don't believe in accent reduction. But I do believe in aiding listener comprehension, of course. I want you to be understood. But beyond being understood, I just can't figure out why we're so obsessed with sounding the same. How boring is that?
And this mindset comes from somewhere, right? Individuals carry that notion with them of not having perfect English.
Ugh.
I read something on social media not too long ago. I can't remember where, but it said something along the lines of how we spend so much time teaching non-native speakers of English to lose their accent to be understood by others, but there's very little focus on getting others to understand accentedness.
Wow. Yeah.
So
Absolutely true.
yeah. So I went to the store this summer and there was a woman from Somalia. And this is an assumption. I assume she was from Somalia because of the location I was in. I was in central Minnesota, and the fact that there's a big Somali population in the area. And she was walking through the store and she asked somebody, a store worker, a question in extremely clear words. It wasn't difficult. And the person was like, I'm sorry, I don't understand you. Because that person, at least, from my perspective, they didn't really try to understand, or she didn't have the training to understand an accent different from her own. And so I went up, I heard it, and I told her, this is what she's looking for. I think it was a scooter or something. And I felt like, okay, maybe I had this debate, like, should I intervene or not? But at some point I was like, this individual was very well spoken and clear, and I wanted to validate that in a sense. Maybe I shouldn't have intervened in that moment. I didn't want to come across as some white savior coming to save the day, but she did seem grateful.
I think I would have done the same. But yeah, we need to be careful. We don't want to make anyone feel like they have to be saved. But sometimes it's just so frustrating, and you want to defend our beautifully accented students or friends or just people that we see in the store.
Oof. Big topic for another discussion.
Yeah. But anyway, we're language teachers. We're trained to understand accented English, but isn't all English accented? Like, you and I speak a little differently. And then, people in different regions of the US speak differently. Learners of English are expected to understand all of those different varieties of English because they're spoken by native speakers. So what's the difference here? Is it the person? Is it because she's wearing, I don't know, is she wearing a burqa? Does she have a darker complexion?
Yes, and she was, and she did. And there are so many assumptions at play here, right? In that situation, I made assumptions about what was going on between the two women based on who I pictured them to be. And the store clerk was making an assumption about not being able to understand the customer's English because she looked and spoke differently than her. And there's a tendency to shut down without the information that we actually need to be able to communicate. We're just making these projections based on our own lived experiences.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, if I showed up and I was speaking like, a Rhode Islander, as I do in Minnesota,
which you did over the summer.
I did. But if I showed up with my regional accent, that store worker is still going to understand me because I'm a native speaker speaking my native language. and probably not make as much of an assumption about my comprehensibility based on external features. And so I wonder if there's just less conflict in attempting to understand me versus attempting to understand someone who we could assume has immigrated to the US or is at least a descendant of more recent immigration, right? I think that's a great example of implicit bias.
Yes, like a person who has an accent in a language that is a Western language is going to generally be accepted and understood more readily. Many people will hear someone with perhaps a French accent and be like, oh, that's so chic. I love your accent.
Yes. Yep.
But then when presented with a non-European accent, they look at them like, what the heck are you saying? To me, that just seems perceptual, implicit bias, like you said.
And also, why is there an expectation for people who are learning English to do so perfectly? To have this perfect output. But then people who are native English speakers learn a little bit of Mandarin or any other language. They expect to be celebrated for speaking another language.
Absolutely. There is such a double standard, right? It's just crazy to me the differences in what people are expected to do and like what is celebrated and what is considered a requirement. That's where this whole language and power thing intersects with race and ethnicity. I mean, there's just a lot to unpack there.
There is. And so we'll leave it at that for today. English is powerful, and with it come great privileges and injustices. Privileges for those who master so-called standard English, and doubt and suspicion for those who don't, or who look like they shouldn't to the prejudiced eye.
And it's our job as English language educators to call out those injustices that we witness in the teaching and learning of English and do what we can to shift the paradigm to be more inclusive, to decentralize Eurocentric norms and practices that uphold the status quo.
It's not an easy feat.
No, not something that we can tackle in one episode alone. This is the beginning of our conversation here, one that we hope inspires you to reflect on your role in this machine of oppression and contribute to this dialogue.
Yes. So, teachers, we want to hear from you. How do you acknowledge the connection between language and power in your classroom? How do you avoid imposing cultural norms associated with learning English? How do you highlight the validity of English as it is taught and spoken across the globe?
You can join the conversation on our various social media accounts. Email us via our contact form at teacherthinkaloud.com or comment via Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. We welcome your reflections, questions, and ideas.
And for more resources related to today's topic, take a look at our website and our podcast anchor page, anchor.fm/teacherthinkaloud.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Teacher Think Aloud podcast. Big topic today. And until next time, happy teaching
and happy reflecting.